Great to see so many faces here. So hello, colleagues, students, friends, and supporters. It is my great pleasure to introduce our today's guest, renowned speaker, Dr. Volodymyr Kulyk, who just arrived from Ukraine the day before yesterday, so probably a bit jet-lagged, but perhaps
just
not.
A bit.
He was running on the river valley already.
That was yesterday, when it was warmer.
Dr. Kulyk is a specialist in Ukrainian national identity, language policy and language attitudes, ethnopolitics, and media discourse. He's a head research fellow at the Institute of Political and Ethnic Studies at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. He has also taught at Columbia and Stanford Universities, Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and Ukrainian Catholic University, and he's also held fellowships at Harvard, Stanford, University College London, University of Alberta, Woodrow Wilson Center, and other Western scholarly institutions. And next year, Dr. Kulyk will be a visiting professor at Yale University. His research fields include the politics of language, memory, and identity in contemporary Ukraine, language ideologies, nationalism, and media discourse, on which he has widely published in Ukrainian and Western journals and collected volumes. Dr. Kulyk is also the author of 3 books, and the latest one, The Ukrainian Media Discourse, Identities, Ideologies, Power Relations. He also guest edited a special issue of International Journal of the Sociology of Language on the topic Languages and Language Ideologies in Ukraine. Since 2013, Dr. Kulyk has been serving as Ukraine's representative in the European Commission about racism and inequality. Against, right. For about 4 weeks, Dr. Kulyk is our distinguished visiting scholar, supported by the Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies through the Central and East European Studies Aid to Visiting Scholars Fund, and also sponsored by the Research Initiative on Democratic Reforms in Ukraine project, led by Dr. Olenka Bilash, and funded by the Cool Institute of Advanced Studies. And some of you know that this project explores 3 dimensions of the ongoing democratic reform of the government of Ukraine. Dr. Kulyk will have another lecture next week, May 11th, sponsored by Modern Languages and Cultural Studies and the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at 3:30, Pembina Hall 358. And if you would like to take a poster, you're welcome to do so. The topic is Language Ideologies in the Era of Facebook, Ukrainian Social Network Discussions Within and Across Borders. And he will have a 3rd lecture in Ukrainian, sponsored by the Shevchenko Scientific Society, Edmonton branch, on May 22nd at 3 o'clock. And I have a poster here as well if anyone is interested. So without further ado, I would like to ask our speaker to present his talk, after which we will have our discussion. Please welcome Dr. Volodymyr Kulyk.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and to see so many familiar faces in the audience. Perhaps the first time in my life I see more people I know than I don't, which is of course an evidence that I've been here before, and although I haven't run in the river valley so far until this visit, but that's because those visits fell into less fortunate periods of Edmonton's weather. Yeah, but I've talked about similar topics. I've been dealing with language issues for 15 years or something like that, and I'm glad to be able to finally move a bit from those topics on which I've talked and published widely to a less familiar terrain, and this is actually my first attempt to present in public what I've been doing for the last couple of years, trying to combine with older parts. And this is about how what I dare to call globalization, and what is Professor Medvedsky already challenges me to be an inadequate use of the term, but we'll discuss after I present my argument whether or not it's adequate, how markets, transnational flows of information and people and goods and services contribute to the persistence of Russian in the post-Soviet realm, with Ukraine to be the main focus of my research, but with references to other countries to see how the Ukrainian case is typical or atypical in that context. So my main question is as follows. Is it true that Russia persists due to post-imperial inertia? 25 years after the dissolution of the USSR, is it only inertia? Is it because something was created at the Soviet times and it doesn't want to go away? Because, as we believe, Russian is supported by minority protection regime. Russian is prevented from being squeezed out by the interference of Russia, by the watchful eye of the international organizations, by the lenient minority language policy of the host states where these Russian speakers reside and mostly citizens of. Is it only that? Or there are other mechanisms, something which creates new stimuli to learn and use Russian? And if so, what is that? I argue that it is not the case that Russian is only spoken by Russians and those people who learned it at the Soviet time and continue using it because of that lenience and because of that interference. There are, I argue, new stimuli to learn and use it, and globalization as this transnational flow of information and goods and products and people contributes to that tremendously, and we should start looking in that direction. We should be watchful to that part of transnational dynamics, which is interacting essentially with national dynamics. And I will argue that Ukraine, if Ukraine is unique, is because national dynamics contributes to the same persistence and in many cases prevalence of Russian that transnational dynamics contributes to as well. So let me start, as I said, I will be focusing on Ukraine, so the most empirical data and all survey data which are my own comes from Ukraine, but I will also give some census and survey data and coming from other post-Soviet countries. So let me start with one piece of data. This is 2012, February 2012 survey conducted by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. Almost all data I will present on Ukraine come from that survey. I have a new piece of this institute's survey. I commissioned this one thanks to a grant from Shevchenko Society in America, and the new one actually from Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies from September 2014. But I decided to use this older one. It's not that old, 2 years older than that one. But because this is before the war, I don't want the war dynamic to interfere with peaceful dynamic. I argue that these processes are best to be studied in isolation from this rather atypical, abnormal situation which is occurring now in Ukraine. So 2012. I compare the use of Ukrainian, Russian, and as everybody dealing with Ukraine knows, there is a widespread combination of the two languages. Same people can use both languages on occasion, depending on a situation, on the interlocutor, on the mood, or on whatever. So there are people who are unable or unwilling to indicate just one language they prefer. They said both roughly equally. Yeah. So I compare three domains: family use, work use, or when I say work use, it's work or college. If a person, because it's people, adult population, people 18 years and older, some of them still study, so work or college, and reading of fiction. And for fiction, we try to disentangle the language dimension from cultural dimension, for choice of particular authors, styles, genres, and whatever. And so the question was like that: imagine you are in a bookstore and you want to buy a book by a foreign author, which is available both in Russian and Ukrainian translation. Which would you choose? And so supposedly everything else is equal. So what would you choose? Meaning, what language would you prefer? And some say, I don't care about language. Some say, depending on quality. But excluding that, quality of translation, excluding that, language is an important indication. So as we see here, Russian is roughly as widely used as Ukrainian, and of course many people combine the two languages. But what interests me here is not Ukrainian versus Russian, but family versus work and family versus reading of that fiction. Assuming the family is the main domain where people choose whatever reflects their own choice, their own identity, their own desires, their own plans for the future. Especially if they raise kids, they want to raise them in a particular language or some combination of languages. And so, what's the main feature of the comparison between family and work is that Russian is used at work much more than at home. Meaning, many people who prefer Ukrainian and realize that preference in their home communication choose or are forced to use Russian, more Russian at work. That can be because of some pressure of management, or some preference of customers they are dealing with, or because they themselves believe that, unlike at home, at work Russian is more appropriate. People can internalize beliefs which are widespread in society, which are coming from elites, which are coming from the media. So for one reason or another, many people believe that although they speak this language at home, they might need another language at work, and yet another when watching television, and yet another when going to a political demonstration or something. So as I said, many people use different languages for different practices. Yeah. So that's one feature. And if we compare languages of home, which are in blue, where Ukrainian is used considerably more than Russian, and where there is of course widespread combination of the two, but these monolingual columns are higher, taller. Yeah. So if you compare home communication with fiction, we see that in fiction very many people combine both languages. So they say they do not care. They can use both, and depending on the quality, and we can add the price, of course. But that was not in the question. But Ukrainian is used much less than Russian. Definitely. So many more people prefer the Russian translation of the same foreign book, American or French or German or whatever, than Ukrainian one. Why can that be? Because of bigger supply, and they are accustomed to reading in that language because it's more widely available, or because they believe that Russian is still better fit for that practice of translation from foreign languages. And you often can hear, how can the British king speak Ukrainian? There is no question how can the British king speak Russian. Of course, everybody knows Russian. British kings do speak Russian, but they cannot be imagined to speak Ukrainian. So that's inertia of former practices when something was planted in people's head and it is still there. And of course, it is changing. And if this is one practice in which 2014 data are markedly changed from 2012 data, but not to overthrow my argument, not to refute it. So there is inertia, there is perception of quality, so fitness for this practice. But whatever the reason is, we see that many people who can be called Ukrainian speakers because they speak mostly Ukrainian at home, speak Russian at work and in media consumption. Even though in media consumption, given there is a lot to choose from on the market, they should be free to choose whatever they want. And even if they are free, they do not always choose whatever corresponds to their home practice. And if you look further, and I will show you in a second on the next slide, different media types, television and newspapers and the internet, we see differences in the shares of the two languages. And I would say the more globalized this media type is, the more Russian is used there. And we tend to think globalization is English, first and foremost. Because if we are true to the meaning of the word, the global spread is mostly for English. We cannot imagine Russian to be used really globally. But I argue that the same mechanisms which contribute to the global spread of English also contribute to the transnational spread of Russian. For this post-Soviet region and beyond, in many countries of Europe and Asia, which now receive Russian-speaking, for example, tourists or migrant workers or whatever, the mechanism would be the same. So, looking at this different types of media consumption, we see newspapers and television and the internet. In newspapers, the share of Ukrainian is the highest. In television, the share of both languages is the highest. That's because of the supply. Most television channels in Ukraine combine the two languages. So no channel registered in Ukraine broadcast in Russian only or in Ukrainian only. Until recently, there was legislative requirement that a certain amount of airtime be in Ukrainian. In 2012, when a new language law was adopted, that requirement was abolished, but there is inertia first of production and perception of what audience prefers, and there are some conventions, and news should be in Ukrainian, for example, and prime time series should be in Russian, and game shows should be in Russian or something. So a lot of inertia related to particular genres, to particular topics, and that's why Ukrainian did not disappear at once the legal regulation was abolished. But most channels supply content in both languages, and so that is reflected in the fact that 50% of respondents say they consume television, watch television in both languages. And finally, the internet. Here we see the biggest preference for Russian. That's because supply is so much unequal between Ukrainian and Russian. As everybody who tried to use internet in Ukraine knows, even if you do a search in Ukrainian, for the first couple of screens, you will have Russian language websites. Most of them from Russia, but even those from Ukraine. If you are inquiring about something specifically Ukrainian, you will have more Ukrainian origin, Ukrainian produced websites, but they still are more likely to be in Russian than Ukrainian. So that's something which is not changing. And I compared 2012 and 2014 data. Even now, with the war, with some alienation from Russia, with some reluctance to contribute to the financial success of Russian producers by your own consumption, this reliance, predominant reliance on Russian doesn't go away. Maybe a bit higher share of respondents say they use both languages. But then, of course, you should treat that with caution. Maybe saying both, meaning reluctance to admit that it's primarily, predominantly Russian. Yeah. This predominant use of Russian in many domains, and widespread combination of the two languages, is reflected in proficiencies in two languages, which are partly inherited from the Soviet times, but again, 25 years after the USSR, it's not only inherited, it's reproduced and acquired anew by new generations. Yeah? So we still see that proficiency in Russian, and I separately show for all respondents, for Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers. And speakers here are defined by the self-declared, of course, main language of everyday use, rather than self-declared native language. Native language reflects their language identity, and declared language of everyday use reflects language practice. What language you prefer, no matter whether you consider it your native language or just accustomed, imposed, whatever you call it. Yeah. So Ukrainian speakers of course prefer their own language, know their own language better than the other language, than the Russian, but the knowledge of Russian by Ukrainian speakers are much better than the knowledge of Ukrainian by Russian speakers. And that's the main factor contributing to the unequal proficiencies for the whole sample. Yeah? So this is also changing. And in 2014, its inequality is smaller, and maybe in 5 years we will have no inequality at all. But that's one factor which persists, and actually which is reproduced, not necessarily inequality, but the good knowledge of Russian is reproduced with intergenerational change. So as young people replaced old ones, Russian doesn't go away. The knowledge of Russian persists. Let's see here. We see that the youngest generation knows Ukrainian relatively better than the older ones, but they also know Russian better. And in 2012, their proficiency in Russian was much better than in Ukrainian, much higher than in Ukrainian. So intergenerational change doesn't solve this problem of unequal proficiencies. Unlike in some other countries I will talk about in a minute. So given this use and these proficiencies, what do people think? Is it important to know Russian? I asked explicitly this question in 2014, in September 2014. Again, I realized that everybody said, and everything said in 2014 also reflects the perception that there is a war between Ukraine and Russia. And whatever we say reflects not just what we do, but what we consider appropriate. And so this should be taken into account as well. But nevertheless, even in view of this appropriateness of using more Ukrainian, more than 50% of respondents agreed with the statement that for the full-fledged life in Ukraine, knowledge of Russian is no less important than the knowledge of Ukrainian. I combine it with a statement do you agree that the Ukrainian language is one of the symbols of Ukraine's statehood? And there, of course, you had 90% or something. But that symbol, Ukrainian is important as a symbol, which doesn't necessarily mean it should be used. It should be known. Most people agree that the knowledge of Ukrainian is mandatory for all Ukrainian citizens, and it should be valued, respected, displayed on occasion. And very many people now in social networks say how they are proudly use Ukrainian language when traveling abroad. They don't want to be mixed with those Russians, so they use Ukrainian. But once at home, why bother? Especially since Russian is so important for media, for work, and other things we are talking about. So we see that, of course, Russian speakers predominantly agree that the knowledge of Russian is no less important than the knowledge of Ukrainian. Ukrainian speakers predominantly cannot be said to predominantly agree with that, but a quarter of them agree, and another quarter are ambivalent, and only half, lesser than half, disagree. Now, out of Ukraine into the wider post-Soviet world. I have some data, unfortunately rather old, studies, comparable studies of the knowledge of and use of languages in post-Soviet countries are very few. So at least so far I have not been able to find something which could be presented in a table for all countries or for many countries at once. So this was one big study of 2004, and it compares the active and passive knowledge of Russian in all countries were included. I just show you a group of countries, so to not to overburden you with many figures. And I present data on a share of native speakers, so you see how, of course, there is a correlation. The more there are native speakers, they affect the intergroup communication. Yeah, so the more Russian is needed to live in that society, to successfully interact in that society. But we can see that active knowledge of Russian is much higher. The percentage of people with active knowledge of higher is much higher than the percentage of native speakers. So not only, far from the case that only Russian speakers who are either ethnic Russian or assimilated during the Soviet times have the active command of Russian. Many more people have. In Ukraine it's twice as more, and in Latvia and like 50% more, and in Kazakhstan more than half, in Moldova actually 4 times. Only Estonia, we can say, active command is more or less limited to native Russian speakers. The only country. But even there, the equal amount, more than a third of the population have a passive command. So Russian is still widely understood. And the percentage of people who declare no knowledge of Russian. Of course, it's also, this declaration is affected by the perception of appropriateness, of course. And some people argue they do not understand Russian. I remember discussions in Ukraine during the 2001 census, how Ukrainian nationalists or Ukrainian ardent supporters of Ukrainian language argued it is inappropriate to say we know Russian, because that would be used by the state to promote Russian, to grant it a higher status. So we should be careful not to do that. So, just how many people did that is anybody's guess, but we have to take into account that was one factor. But even with that, only in Azerbaijan, with a minuscule proportion of 3% of the population with Russian as a native language, only in that country where Russian should be almost extinct, a surge of the population declares no knowledge of Russian. In all other countries, it's less than a quarter. Yeah, and Ukraine doesn't look very unique here. It's same as Kazakhstan and Moldova and Latvia, and regardless of the fact that the shares of native speakers are very different in these three countries. In Moldova it's 13% and in Latvia it's 41%. Yeah, so nevertheless more than half of the population has active command of Russian. So meaning Russian is still widely known and potentially widely used. Some assorted fact from censuses and from some surveys, we see that Russian is widely known as a second language, and actually in Latvia, for example, with its rigorous nationalizing policy, ethnic Latvians still know Russian better than the other way around. 20 years after independence. And at the same time, we see that Russian is gradually going away, withering away in some countries with smaller proportion of Russian speakers or greater isolation between language groups. Like, for example, in Kazakhstan, we see that people over 55 in 2007 survey said that 90% of them know Russian, younger than 23 years, only 46%. So Russian seems to be going away pretty fast. But of course, in all surveys, you have to be careful what exactly was asked and how the question was understood. What was it? Active command? Was it frequent use? Whatever. Particularly the survey takers had in mind. At the same time, in Kazakhstan, 80% of users prefer non-Kazakhstani websites. That reflects the difference in supply. So there is little to consume on the internet in Kazakhstan, or at least that used to be 10 years ago. Another very interesting survey in Tashkent, and there are similar data for the second city, largest city in Uzbekistan, Samarkand, saying a big discrepancy between home preferences and work practice of the population. While at home, in the capital, of course, there was a big migration of Russians and Russian speakers during the Soviet time. So 44% only, less than half, prefer Uzbek, and 21 both and 29 Russian. So Uzbek prevails over Russian at home, but at work 40% prefer Russian and only 7% Uzbek, and the rest both languages. So similar mechanisms to those I referred to for Ukraine are at work in Uzbekistan as well. So now let's discuss the mechanism. What is behind this persistence of Russian? What exactly, what practices, what factors can account for that? I already mentioned the media, so let's start with the media. In many countries of the former Soviet Union, Russian media and cultural products are more widespread and more popular than local and Western ones. For Ukraine, we know that primetime TV is dominated, even now, by Russian or Russian language products. And when I say Russian language, those products which were produced by Ukrainian companies, but for the consumption in both Ukraine and Russia. And that is reflected not only in the language, which is Russian for both countries, but also in ideology, which is no less, I would say, even more detrimental for Ukrainian nation building. So this is an ideology of inherent commonality of the two people at best, and actually denial of separate Ukrainian nationhood and statehood at worst. And now we see some of the most kind of poisonous of these products are prohibited in Ukraine because they also glorify some repression against Ukrainians, or glorify Russian army and security forces, which are now widely blamed for what they do in the Donbass. So, but that's the tip of the iceberg. only most visible, most conspicuous of these products are prohibited. Most of them kind of love stories, comedies, and all kind of less conspicuous topics and situations are still there, and they still dominate prime time. Talk shows, music programs, large majority of songs on FM radio, in the internet, news, all kinds of consumer information. I'm still at loss to find a description of for example, medicine, which would not be either in Russian or a computer translation from Russian into Ukrainian. So if I'm very persistent, I can find it in Ukrainian, but I can hardly read that Ukrainian, because that's really a computer translation from Russian. And that's just one example, which I'm well familiar, because I happen to be looking at those products pretty often. This prevalence of Russian can be looked at from points of view of producers and consumers. Producers prefer Russian because it gives a larger market. Whatever is in Russian can be sold in Russia, in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, so in many countries, sometimes even in non-post-Soviet countries like Israel, or I don't know. There are cable channels, for example, in Germany, which operate in Russian. So even there, you can show something. But basically, it's primarily about post-Soviet markets, and Russia and Ukraine in particular. The production becomes cheaper, and there is no need to translate these products for showing in Ukraine into Ukrainian, because as I say in the bottom line, overwhelmingly Ukrainians prefer to watch Russian products in Russian, in the original language. They argue, why? We still know the language. We can love it better than Ukrainian or less than Ukrainian. But we know the language well. Why bother translating, or why endure inadequate translation? So looking, that's the kind of start from a consumer side of the coin. Yeah, consumers tend to believe that Russian products are of higher quality than Ukrainian products, on average, and more relevant than Western products, or Turkish or whatever, Chinese, Korean products, yeah? But mostly it's Russian versus Hollywood production. These are ours, they say. These are about us, and those are about somebody else. We can look at that with amusement, with curiosity, with some helpful knowledge, but that's still not about us. And the inherent commonality is at work here. It is widely believed that whatever describes Russians or some unidentified, unspecified post-Soviet people speaking Russian and showing signs in Russian or whatever is about us. So we are still not fundamentally different than those people shown in those production of Russia. And many critics argued that producers meticulously erased all traces of localities and kind of actual facts other than Russian speakers. They are saying, if there is a sign on a store called Moloko, it will remain, because it's the same in Ukrainian and Russian. And if it says Kyiv, it will be removed, because it's different. Lately, there appeared some products which showed kind of recognizable traces of Ukraine. but only if everything else is still common. So good guys are those who believe in this friendship and commonality and who hate Ukrainian nationalists, and nationalists are of course bad guys. Only under this condition can these products be shown in Russia, and if they are not to be acceptable in Russia, they are not to be produced at all, because the revenues from Russia are much higher, and that's why producers cannot even be bothered to start doing that unless they are sure that they can sell it in Russia. I show this preference for language, for the original language, by comparing preferences for Western movies and series and preference for Russian movies and series. The same survey of 2012 by Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. We see that for the sample as a whole, there is some, and the options were Ukrainian sound with Russian subtitles, Russian sound with Ukrainian subtitles, and Russian sound. I added this option with subtitles to kind of mitigate this dichotomy, not either Ukrainian or Russian, but to give the respondent more options. So the language dimension is just one, but at the same time to probe into subtitles as a way out of this dilemma. In principle, subtitles can give you the chance of having two languages in one show. Yeah, we see that it's not a popular option. People don't like that. There is no tradition of consuming series and movies with subtitles in the post-Soviet space, and people are still reluctant to do that. We are not a Nordic country. No. We see the preference for Russian, even in the sample as a whole. More remarkably, of course, Russian speakers prefer predominantly just Russian sound and no Ukrainian at all. But Ukrainian speakers, even for Western movies, about a quarter of them agree to live with Russian or actively prefer Russian. So either only Russian, about 15%, or another 10% Russian with Ukrainian subtitles. Yeah, and it's nothing to compare with Russian speakers who are less than about 5% want Ukrainian sound for Western products. But that's Western, supposedly neutral, same as this book, with books translated from foreign languages. Yeah, so neutral situation. Now coming to Russian movies, and here we see a great majority wants Russian sound and no Ukrainian at all. Even for Ukrainian speakers, almost half of them prefer to watch in Russian with no Ukrainian subtitles even, and with subtitles it would be two-thirds. So that's how preference of consumers reinforces tendencies of producers not to bother with other languages, just cover all this post-Soviet market with one language. And unfortunately for Ukrainian, it is not limited to the media. Another practice which is contributing, in my view, heavily to the prevalence of Russian, which is pretty new, and which is one of the aspects of globalization. This is transnational tourism. Russians and Russian speakers are the most, or one of the most numerous groups of tourists in post-Soviet countries and many other European countries. And not only European. If you look at Turkey, if you look at Egypt, but also European, like Montenegro, Croatia, Cyprus. Since post-Soviet people usually do not know English and do not know local languages of those countries like Latvian or Ukrainian or Georgian, they have to be serviced in Russian. And once Russian is established as a must, as a preference of important group of customers, then Russian is also imposed on those who maybe would prefer service in their languages, like Ukrainian or Georgian or Moldovan, but nobody asks them. Russian is an option, and you understand Russian, right? So don't complain. And this is also the practice for non-post-Soviet countries like Turkey and Egypt, with mass tourism starting to these from post-Soviet space to these countries like 20-something years ago, Russians came first, and Russians came in greater numbers. And when Ukrainians joined them, or Belarusians, or some numbers of Moldovans and Georgians and whoever, they just joined the groups. That was some organizational reasons for that, because companies from post-Soviet space worked directly with Turkish or Egyptian companies. For example, tour operators and Moldovans or Georgians were just too few to establish separate channels. But Ukrainians were not too few. But still, since most of them many of them prefer, maybe more of them preferred Russian because most of them were urbanites, and so for them Russian was the language of choice. But even those who did not prefer Russian could live with Russian and still preferred Russian to English, for example. Yeah. So for all these people, Russian appeared as a language which meets you at the airport already, and then if it's guided tours or it is package tours, you are picked up at the airport by a Russian-speaking guide, often coming from the same country as you, from Ukraine, but servicing not just Ukrainians but also Russians and other post-Soviets. So Russian is the language spoken there, and then all the service will be in Russian, and you cannot complain because they are trying to accommodate you. At least they are servicing you in a language you understand, right? Yes. And these Turks or Egyptians made a great effort to learn the language. You cannot really reject it. You should respect that. You should value their effort. And unlike at home, where we Ukrainians have a great advantage of being able to speak to our respective languages. I can speak Ukrainian, and my interlocutor can speak Russian back. Theirs is not an option, because these Turks and Egyptians and Montenegrins will not know the language. So in this case, transnationality is something which contributes to the dominance of transnationally used and known languages. Whatever dynamics is established at home, whatever practice we can benefit from, this non-reciprocal bilingualism, as my colleague Vlad calls it, it's not applicable to these inherent and transnational interactions. Locals invest heavily in Russian. Previously, they invested heavily in German. Previously, they invested heavily in English. Yeah. So, but now they invested in Russian. They see Ukrainians coming with good knowledge of Russian. Many of them with preference for Russian. They see no need to add Ukrainian, let alone Moldovan or Belarusian or Georgian to their repertoire. It's too many languages anyway, and that's visible if you walk in those seaside towns, yeah, or in big tourist cities. Public signs, menus in restaurants, guides, commercial ads, whatever is available. And service, if we come back to tourism in post-Soviet countries like Ukraine or the Baltics or Georgia, service for foreign tourists also benefits local Russian speakers, because their language is used more than it would be otherwise. Yeah, so due to this foreign tourists, fewer people can refuse to speak Russian, because that's where their money come from, at least a significant part of their money. Now, transnational migration. There is an increasing stream of Russians and Russian speakers from post-Soviet space emigrating or living part-time in other European and non-European countries, sometimes in a very large number to justify service in their respective languages in some practices. They buy property, they buy goods, they consume services. In the Baltics, in Crimea, well before the annexation, or in southern Ukraine, like Odessa, in Montenegro, in Cyprus, again, you see signs, you see menus, you hear language of tours and so on. Many Ukrainians who live there join Russian-speaking communities for practical or psychological reasons. They go to churches with Russian language of sermon, Church Slavonic language of service. If they don't have their own Ukrainians, they consume Russian language media, like local newspapers or TV channels, and they have informal networks, in many cases limited to Russian speakers from post-Soviet space, because they are still not very good at the host language of the country. Migrant workers, seasonal or long-term workers from post-Soviet countries in Russia, from Ukraine, from Moldova, from Central Asia. Everybody knows that in Moscow, for example, Central Asian migrant workers are really a visible phenomenon, so something which cannot be ignored demographically or sociolinguistically. Also in other parts of the former Soviet Union, like Ukraine, we have many migrants from Caucasus, from Central Asia, who can rely on Russian, because most of them come to the cities where Russian is either preferred or fully understood, and seeing no active rejection of their Russian, they are encouraged to continue using it without learning Ukrainian. Rather a typical situation where migrants do not accommodate linguistic preferences of the population so actively as it's mostly done, because linguistic preferences of the host population are mixed and maybe with the preference for Russian. In 2013, Russia was the main destination of Ukrainian migrant workers. Since the war, the flow has decreased significantly, but far from stopping. In this way, as I say, Russian is imposed on migrants in Russia and also on Ukrainians dealing with post-Soviet migrants, because again, here non-reciprocal bilingualism cannot be actively used. Somehow I can say tsibulia when I go to the market and buy from this migrants from Caucasus or Central Asia. But if they do not understand, I have to choose either saying look or going to buy from somebody else. And most people, of course, do not bother. They say whatever is needed to be understood. That's two signs from my trip in 2015, in the fall of 2015 to Tallinn. On the left is a public. Sorry, it's probably hard to see it, but on the left is a tourist sign. So what is where? And it is done by the municipal authorities, who are guided by some regulations and also by their sense of appropriateness, kind of political correctness or whatever. So this is in Estonian and in English. So that's how it is appropriate to do anywhere in the world. Yeah. So there is local language and there is international language. No Russian there. And to the right is a sign that the house is for sale. And here you see English, and then Russian, and only later Estonian. It is not expected that Estonians will be buying this house in downtown Tallinn. It's more expected that foreign tourists, who can, of course, come from Scandinavia, or from Germany, or from other parts of Europe. But for all of those, it's English, because they are expected to understand it. And anyway, it shouldn't be too long with Finnish, with German, with French. For Russians, it should be Russian because they are not expected to understand. Their limited multilingualism, to say mildly, makes their language a must in all such commercial transactions. Finally, workplace. As I call it, production and consumption. I argued at the beginning that at work, Russian is used much more than at home. The question is it globalization or imperial or post-imperial inertia? Is it international dynamic, transnational dynamic, or local dynamic of interaction between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers? Many jobs, of course, require Russian due to transnational nature. Media, tourism, some productions and services which are part of post-Soviet kind of changed corporations. But there are not that many in relative terms. Many more more often Russian is preferred by owners or managers within Ukraine, or chosen to accommodate preferences of consumers within Ukraine, target consumers, those most valued customers who are perceived to be having more money than others, yeah? Or be more likely to buy that. And here, I argue, local, internal domestic dynamic is more important than transnational. It's urban needs versus rural migrants coming to work in the cities and powerless to impose their preferences on their employers and fellow workers. And also well-off people versus poor people. Well-off are more valued customers, and their preferences are prioritized by producers. And in Ukraine, there is still correlation. Urbanites are obviously more likely to speak Russian than rural residents and rural migrants. That's rural migrants tend to switch to Russian at work and in the interlingual communication, but also there is still correlation that well-off people are more likely to speak Russian than Ukrainian. They are relatively well disposed toward Ukrainians. They support promotion of Ukrainian, but in their own speech they strongly prefer Russian. So another practice is that globalized production of goods and services very often imposes Russian as the only language for all Ukrainian market. Sometimes there's two options: for English for foreigners and Russian for locals, for all locals. You go for websites, you go to websites of many Western producers, starting with Lufthansa or Air France, to producers of computers, of refrigerators, so many things, global. They come to the post-Soviet market, and they do not bother, at least in Ukraine, they do not bother to speak both languages. They impose Russian as one size fits all. Still, most people do not have problems with that. Most people either prefer Russian or accept Russian as a legitimate choice in the situation where they have both groups of customers. But lately, there has been more protests than before. Some vocal protests, some campaign of boycotts, so some movements to make Ukrainian at least one option. It's too far from the stage where Ukrainian would be the dominant option, the number one option, but still English, Russian, and Ukrainian or something, yeah, English, Ukrainian, and Russian, at least to be among the valued customers, and not to be neglected completely. That's what Ukrainian speakers, most active Ukrainian speakers, fight for. To conclude, unlike it is often believed globalization does not only stimulate acquisition and use of English, but also of transnationally known languages. In our case, Russian, but it's also can be Hindi, it can be Chinese, it can be Spanish. Languages which are widely known in more than one country are prioritized in the transnational production, consumption, and movement. Due to inherited proficiency and use, Russian has advantage over the titular language in Ukraine or in other post-Soviet countries, over titular languages in those domains which are regulated by the markets rather than by the state laws. Yeah, so there are no prescriptions for what language should be used in market regulations. As I said, even for the media, whatever regulations were in use were abolished in 2012. The globalization therefore reinforces the post-imperial advantage of Russian by stimulating transnational flows of goods and services which prioritize languages with many more speakers across the border in different countries. But still, I argue that Ukraine is not exactly a typical case. It's rather extreme in the post-Soviet context because the very high number, the very big share of Russian speakers within Ukraine, the high social status of these speakers gives them advantage even in the domestic context, and thus global players come into Ukrainian markets, see who is the boss, and cater to the boss, to the Russian speakers. And whatever Ukrainian speakers can win over in the competition within Ukraine is often undermined by these global preferences for largely known, for widely known, for bigger languages. That's how it is a challenge for Ukrainian language policy. We cannot cancel globalization, we cannot avoid it, we cannot hide from it, but we still resent the fact that globalization undermines the effort of Ukrainian state and Ukrainian speaking elites to promote Ukrainian, to give Ukrainian more voice, to give Ukrainian more power. And that's something the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian elites have to deal with. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Kulyk. I believe that we could have the floor for discussion, and I would just ask you to ask questions and not to provide lengthy comments. Questions? Dr. Linsky?
Yes, thank you for a wonderful talk. I totally agree with you. I'm just wondering about the trends in Ukraine in particular, and perhaps in other post-Soviet countries, of English. Is it possible that it might displace Russian as a transnational language? Or are there any signs that it is?
Thank you. So far, I don't see signs that English has displaced Russian anywhere, except international organizations or international kind of corporations which are working closely without many contacts, but these are very few cases. Yeah, so usually they interact with local populations. Some are having strict language codes which oblige them to use the national language, Ukrainian, so they have translations into Ukrainian. If they are governments, if they are international organizations, some are using the power language. Commercial organizations use translations into Russian. In some cases, you see hesitancy between the two, and kind of the instinct go for Russian, but if you insist, they they remember that they should be using Ukrainian. Some, for example, Canadians are well known for preferring strongly Ukrainian. I think that has to do with the power of diaspora in Canada, which is different from example from the US. Yeah, so I remember first time I was to come here in '99. I applied for a Canadian visa, and I witnessed a scene when a person submitted an application in Russian and was asked to write another one in Ukrainian. So I mean, it's either English or French, yeah, or the local language. But usually people believe that if it's a local language, it's language of their choice, either Russian or Ukrainian. But the Canadian consulate insisted, and it's something which is unheard of in most other interactions, including at consulates. So. The knowledge of English is growing very fast, but as I say, the knowledge of Russian doesn't diminish, doesn't go away. And the discrepancy is still huge between the number of people knowing English and knowing Russian. And of course, if you look at particular domains, particular practices, prestige domains, there, of course, everybody speaks English and Russian, and maybe a bit less speak Ukrainian, but pretty much everybody again, because that's prerequisite for the job. So maybe in their internal interaction, English is number one language. Yeah, the most valued, the most important, the most frequently used. In this narrow sense, English is displacing Russian, but these pockets are very few and far between.
Well, it looked like young generation actually really good with Russian, even better than the old generation. I don't know exactly how is the old Ukrainian trends, but for example, with my colleagues, we didn't learn Russian at school, and maybe that's the question of written language, because many of my colleagues would choose written English instead of written Russian because we don't know the grammar. So I wonder if you address these issues, because now Russian is not taught at schools anymore.
Thank you. First, it's not the case that Russian is not taught at school at all. Many schools do teach Russian. Especially recently, since 2011, 12, I believe, there was an increasing use of Russian at school as a subject, because the Minister of Education Tabachnik introduced this kind of device to stimulate, he was very pro-Russian, to stimulate the use of Russian, the learning of Russian by introducing a mandatory teaching of a second foreign language. Fully aware that for many schools it's very hard to ensure adequate teaching even of one foreign language. But he insisted, because he knew that the easiest way for them to comply with that requirement would be to have Russian as that second foreign language, even though that was in violation with the legal status of Russian as a language of minority or later regional language rather than foreign language. And this confusion could have been easily resolved in favor of rejecting Russian as a choice as a second foreign language had Ukraine had independent courts. Yeah, so that was not possible under Yanukovych. But since then, there was no widespread switch from Russian as a second foreign language to German or French. So some schools did switch, some individual parents did switch, but still, it's very hard for many schools, especially in the countryside, to ensure adequate, to find even teachers capable of anyhow learning German or French. Yeah, so they are happy to be able to have Russian as a second foreign language. But generally, it depends on how people interpret the question.
Still
Yes, as far as I know. There was no official cancellation of that. It depends on how people interpret the question. The question was, how would you evaluate your knowledge of Ukrainian and Russian? Separate questions, yeah? Very good, medium level, bad, very bad. Not applicable, hard to say. What's knowledge is their interpretation. It's written, it's oral, it's both. My guess is, based partly on focus group discussions, that people are more likely to interpret it as pertaining to oral communication rather than written. So no knowledge of grammar doesn't prevent them from saying, I know Russian. Because I can speak it, I can read it, I can watch TV, I can do everything in that language except of correctly write, but who cares about correctness? And when social networks appeared en masse in Ukraine, very many people revealed first their inadequate level of written Russian, but their readiness to use it nevertheless. Especially with Kontakte. Very many people, even from Western Ukraine, Ukrainian speakers with obviously inadequate level of written Russian, use it nevertheless. So many people write Russian with gross mistakes, but that doesn't prevent them. First, they are Ukrainian, maybe know better, and second, since they think in Russian, that would be unnatural for them to translate it into Ukrainian, even though they might happen to write Ukrainian more correctly. So regardless of that, they believe that they have active command, and they believe that that command, that level of proficiency entitles them or should be reflected, so makes it appropriate to use Russian in all practices, even in writing. I don't think it's related to cohort, to age. Here, all the people knew Russian words than this cohort below 60 because I believe their education took place before the large-scale Russification of the 80s. So in the less Soviet decades, Russian was imposed very strongly by the regime. Before that, there was much less of Russian, and so many people, especially in the countryside, knew Russian not so well, and living in the countryside, they didn't have much use for that, and so their perception is, somehow. But since it's a question between, for example, very good and medium level, so these are combined percentages for very good and good, yeah. And if people say over 60 that on the medium level, that's still the know. They can still watch TV and even prefer TV in some cases in Russian, and they might answer that of course they want to watch Russian products in the language of the original, yeah. But their percentage would be lower.
Another question, Dr. Hickman?
To what degree the relative proximity of the languages plays a role, because about 15-20 years ago I traveled in Romania and Hungary. I didn't know those two languages. Russian was absolutely useless. Literally nobody spoke Russian that I tried to engage with. I could only speak English, and in one case, Ukrainian.
Yeah, I can imagine that in this southern Bukovina, Ukrainian would be more useful than Russian, definitely. But of course, proximity is a factor. Proximity makes it possible to get by with the least preferred language of your interlocutor. But it's not only that. First, of course, proximity is symmetrical, and the understanding is asymmetrical. Ukrainians understand Russian much better than Russians understand Ukrainian. So it's not only proximity, but also exposure. In the Soviet times and due to all these practices in the post-Soviet times, Ukrainians are exposed to Russian much more than Russians, I mean in Russia, are exposed to Ukrainian. And that's why Russians in Russia are so different from Russians in Ukraine, who do understand Ukrainian mostly, yeah, because they are exposed to that. Even during the Soviet times, Ukrainian radio spoke out of its 18 hours, spoke maybe 16 hours in Ukrainian. Unlike television, for example. Yeah, so in some practices, you still heard or read or saw Ukrainian. So exposure made it possible to understand, maybe in some cases mandatory to understand Ukrainian, even though across the border there was no such proficiency. And also in terms of non-related languages, I heard that Moldovans, unlike Romanians, still strongly prefer Russian series and movies to Romanian ones. It's also a cultural thing. What is ours? They might believe, unlike language, which is close, which is similar with Romanians, cultural universe is similar with Russians. And so but also inertia of genre conventions, yeah, how it is done. They are accustomed to watching a Russian series, and they are shown in prime time, they have huge ratings, and Moldovans are extremely unpopular, even though they are in their same language. Yeah, so it's not exclusively about language, it's also about culture, of course, about inertia and so on.
I think we will take one more question, because 2 more questions, you get a special privilege treatment, Dr. Meditsky. So first, Dr. Petreshin, and then...
On affirmative action by state agencies, I wonder if you would comment a little bit about the situation in the Army. Is the Army Ukrainianizing its soldiers? Secondly, what are these new laws on broadcasting? Are they beginning to have some effect? And thirdly, of course, I'd be interested in Ukrainian in the universities. What are the trends, and is it working?
Thank you. With regard to the army, I believe it's rather Russifying the recruits than Ukrainizing them. In the early 90s, it was widely believed that the then Defense Minister Konstantin Morozov and his deputy Volodymyr Mohyla launched an ambitious Ukrainizing program pertaining to both language and kind of culture, ideology, and nation building in the army. And there was even some research by Western scholars on that. But they were in power for a very short period. And then it was no research, to my knowledge, only anecdotal evidence. And anecdotal evidence was that mostly everybody spoke Russian. And if Ukrainian-speaking recruits found themselves in a predominantly Russian-speaking environment, they had to accommodate the majority preference, and especially those in command usually spoke Russian, and soldiers could not argue with officers, definitely. And now there is more attention to that because army is a focus of public attention, unlike 10 years or 5 years ago even. And more discussion about the language in the army, because it is rather than be looked at as an evidence of whether the state policy is working or not, is implemented duly or not, it is used as an argument in favor of some state policy. Look, how our defenders are speaking, that's how the state should speak. It's the other way around, yeah? And the argument is that pretty much everybody, or a majority in the army, including these volunteer battalions, speak Russian, and that's why the state should be using more Russian. Whether or not it's true, I don't know. I cannot. But those who have the pages in social networks definitely prefer Russian. That I can say. How representative they are, but of course, those having active communication via social networks, those who are popular in social networks, are more likely to come from educated strata from big cities, yeah, from some rather atypical biographies, yeah. So and they are not like poor soldiers, poorly educated from the countryside who would be happy to speak Ukrainian, but who will let them. Broadcasting. I don't know what law you mean. If you mean 2012 law, the 2012 law abolished regulations on the language of broadcasting. Since after that, the National TV and Radio Council made it known that all broadcasting companies can change their registration, removing the article, the licenses, registration licenses, removing the article on the languages. So instead of saying we will have 75 or 70 or 80% of Ukrainian, and for nationwide broadcasters, 75 was a minimum. And actually, before that, this council pressured them for acquiring high obligations, like assuming 80% or 85%, like ideally up to 100. But since then, it was possible to remove that altogether. As I said, Ukrainian did not immediately disappear, but the trend is clear. Ukrainian is disappearing, and even now, after 2014, again, languages is under scrutiny. Social networks are there to inform everybody about their findings, and they are saying that kind of during 2015, Ukrainian was disappearing at a rate of 1% per month. Which is of course frightening, which is of course very disturbing, and the state so far is doesn't seem to be ready to do anything about that. I believe there would be some point at which the pressure would be so high they will do it. But so far the state prefers not to interfere in the fear of a kind of antagonizing potential of interference. Yeah, so better not to do anything. But by not doing anything, they contribute to marginalization of Ukrainian, and supporters of Ukrainian would be louder and more influential, and especially before the election, that might become a topic. And finally, universities. I don't know much about universities. I haven't done any research myself and haven't seen much research on the linguistic dimension of that. Generally speaking, education, including higher education, is one of the domains of relative success of Ukrainization. But as far as I know, it varies greatly by region. And of course, in Lviv, everything is Ukrainian. In Kyiv, majority is in Ukrainian, and in Kharkiv and Odessa, is a plurality or even majority would be in Russian, and instructors are given choice, and usually when they have choice, they either use Russian because that's their preferred language, or they go and ask the audience, the students, what they want, and students are happy to say Russian. Yeah, and so as far as I know, there is no strong pressure at most universities to strictly adhere to Ukrainian.
Let's have our last question.
Somewhat similar to what Roman asked. My question is, do you have post-Maidan statistics?
Statistics comes from various problematic sources. For example, monitorings of TV and radio done by NGOs supporting the use of Ukrainian. And the figure I mentioned, that Ukrainian is disappearing at a tempo of 1% per month, comes from one of such monitorings. There is some statistics on there is an organization called Prostor Svobody. You can go to their website. Had I known, I would have brought some data of theirs. They confirm that the situation is varies greatly by domain. Of course, Ukrainian is by the region, of course, too. The Ukrainian is prevalent in education, in public administration, but of course is very problematic in the media, in businesses. For example, in a restaurant, it's in many cities it is not possible to get a menu in Ukrainian at all. Although yesterday I saw on Facebook a post by a Turkish cafe in Zaporizhia with a sign make an order in Ukrainian and get a 10% discount. So not everything is so bad. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kulyk. And you know that Dr. Kulyk will be here for a few more weeks. I would like to invite you again next week, next Wednesday. There are some posters also May 22nd, his lecture in Ukrainian. And also if you have questions, you can always approach him. He's here. Thank you again.
Thank you.